All right, there we go. Well, I'm not going to go back through the introduction part because it's just for the recording anyways. If anybody wants to find me, there's my About Me slide. You can get to all my information there. So let's start this off with how I love to think about in the SQL Server world, we had this concept of accidental DBA. So I brought this concept up into the Postgres world and they're like, what's an accidental DBA? And I'm like, well, it's a person that just gets handed a database that they have to start working on. And they're like, we don't have any of that. We have people that come from Oracle. We have people that come from Mysql, something else. We don't really have any accidental DBAs. I'm like, yes, you do. You have a lot of accidental DBAs. You just don't realize it. So I wanted to really focus on this as somebody that is the same thing, that they are an accidental DBA, that they're using SQL Server or something else, and somehow they were handed a Postgres instance. Okay, somebody said to you as your CTO, hey, we've got this new software out there. We need to go ahead and just manage it. You're the database guy. Go figure it out for Postgres. It's the same stuff. It's just Postgres. Little did they know that's not true at all. Okay, it's not the same stuff. There's many different things, but that's where this session will help you and learn about some of those things there too. So if you've managed some other relational databases in the past, maybe if you're a DevOps or a software engineer, or you're just brand new into Postgres, this is what it's really for. Why do I have a picture of a bunch of rocks in the back of my car, which is really, really silly? Because I'm not a landscaper, but I did a lot of landscaping on my house, okay? There was a big wedding at the end of the summer and all that work went into it. And so this is why I was an accidental landscaper, just like an accidental DBA. So let's get started on this. So right now, let's talk about the first day when you get to Postgres. First day that you get there and you get this new database and everything else. And a lot of people always say to me, well, it's my first day. I'm trying to figure it out. Where are my backups? Hold on, back it up a little bit. You can't just go straight to backups because when it comes to Postgres, you may not even know how to connect to the database. See, the difference is SQL Server, you had an infrastructure of Windows, you had Active Directory, you had DNS names and everything else that were always there. It's a different world when you get into the Linux infrastructure of Postgres. So you're not necessarily perfectly ready to just connect to the database. I find that a lot of people that are used to a Windows environment have a hard time just figuring out where to connect to Postgres in the system. So the first thing we're going to talk about is how do you actually connect to it and how do you get started with it, okay? And I'm going to show pictures here in a second. I did not break this into a lot of demos because it's really, really hard for me to share right now with this whole setup and everything. But I have slides here to show what you're going to usually use. Now, the good news is that a lot of people will say to you, there's no GUI tools for Postgres. That's not true. There's plenty of GUI tools for Postgres, so you can use them just like you use Management Studio. They're not necessarily built into the system like Management Studio, but that doesn't mean that they're not there. And I can tell you right now, if you're looking for Management Studio experience, like what you get in Management Studio for Postgres, buy a third-party tool, okay? We use dbeaver here, we use DataGrip. Some people use these, there's one called Squirrel, I believe, SQL. There's a couple others out there. Use one of those tools if you're trying to get closer to an SSMS management interface, okay? If you're just trying to get connected and just trying to do some things with Postgres, the PG admin that comes with it should be just fine. And that's what I'm going to show you today is PG admin. But for sure, if you're going further into it, if you want writing queries all the time, stuff like that, I would suggest a third-party tool. And a lot of people will say to me, well, no, you also got to teach them command line. I'm like, hold on. If they're coming from a heavy Windows environment, the first thing we don't want to walk into is a command line, okay? We're not ready for that. We're not there. So command line is a great tool for Postgres, but please be careful when you're starting to get to that point that you understand how the Linux operating system works, because everything in the command line is going to be related to Linux, not to Windows. When I started this whole path, when I did this whole thing, I started about 5 years ago. I came into a company and they were only using Postgres and they were pretty much Linux for everything. And I was more SQL Server before that. I did some big data and some Linux work, but very little. I was much more Windows environment. So I had to learn the Linux command line with it. I had to learn Vim and crons and configures and all of those sort of aspects I had to learn along with Linux. And there was no Windows version of Linux at that time. So that's really where my experience is that I had to learn all of that. It took me I would say it took me about a month to get really comfortable with Linux and editing and modifying things to get there. So you can expect the same thing. If you're used to PowerShell or something else, that might be less for you. But for me, it was about a month. And then I got more comfortable with the entire Postgres ecosystem, probably, I don't know, 3 to 6 months or so. My knowledge of the relational database, of indexes and all of that came very quickly. That was not a problem. It was just how do you interact with it and how do you work with it? So I'm going to show those things right now so that you can start getting started on it. By the way, I forgot to mention it. If you can unmute and ask a question, go right ahead. I'm not going to stop you. If not, please put it in the chat and somebody go ahead and ping me and say, hey, there's a question in the chat. I love it when people interrupt me during sessions because it's much more interactive. So please feel free to interrupt me as I go through if you have a question.
Okay, that's good to know.
Thank you, Chad. I appreciate that. So let's talk about the connection here. And I apologize on my screen. This is a little washed out, but hopefully you're seeing the boxes in between each one. But basically it is a same register server. Okay, so it's just like when you say new connection in Management Studio, you have to tell it a host name, you have to tell it a port. Well, you usually don't because a lot of this stuff, again, in Windows is already known. You have DNS and other things like that. So with Postgres, you're going to find yourself a lot saying, I need to put in a specific host name or a specific IP address a lot of the times. You won't necessarily have as much of that ease of use of, I'm looking for server A and it just finds it. You've got to know exactly where it is. The port is 5432 instead of 1433. That's not a big deal. A lot of relational databases use different ports. Most of your database stuff is going to be in the Postgres database. That's kind of a simple database that's always there. We'll talk about database and schema here in a minute too, because they are different. They're not the same things between the two. Yeah, go ahead.
So is the Postgres database a little bit like the master database?
No, Postgres
Okay.
is more of a user database that's created just by default that it's always there. It doesn't really have a connection like master does where it stores everything in SQL Server.
Okay.
So, and you know what, we'll segue to that right now. I think I talk about this later on in there, but I'll talk about this right now. One of the key things as you're going through this concept is that SQL Server built an engine that uses, basically it's a little operating system in those files of SQL Server. So SQL Server has its own OS to manage its engine. If everybody understands that, SQL Server has a task scheduler, it has a file structure inside it, it has a management component. All of that is actually in SQL Server. It's written in code. Postgres doesn't do that for its backend file system. It does it directly off Linux or Windows if you have a Windows version of Postgres. So it does not have its own OS managing all of that. So there's a big difference between those two because of those key things. All right, it's very important to understand that because SQL Server packages it all, and you have, you know, that code inside there, whereas Postgres does not. You're much more tied to your box in Postgres than you are in SQL Server. Okay, so the other items on here, there's not really a lot of other things in here. Like you said, you can do things like Kerberos authentication. You can use Active Directory. You just have to get it set up in a Linux world, and there's not a lot of that. I mentioned earlier, I didn't have Windows Postgres when I started. They do have Windows Postgres now. And I will say that it's starting to gain some adoption because of some of the work that Microsoft has been doing. You can get a lot of Azure Postgres right now. You can get a lot of Windows Postgres. So they have been investing in it. But when I first started 3 or 4 years ago, no one would put a production workload onto a Windows Postgres edition. It just didn't happen. Okay. I would say now that's changed, but you definitely see a lot more Linux out there than you do see Windows. Okay, it's probably 80%, 90% Linux and 10% Windows. All right, so that's kind of the first stage, just getting connected, just getting started. That's all you really got to worry about, those sort of things that you're using and what you're doing related to that. Now let's talk about those actual backups, okay? So now that you're connected, the first thing you really think about, of course, is backups. What do I do about my backups? So we were talking about this right before everybody got on. Jonathan and I were talking about this. And you have to understand, Jonathan asked this great question, where are the transaction logs? And I'm like, well, there's sort of transaction logs, they're sort of not. They're called a wall log. It's called the write-ahead log. Every relational database has to have some sort of log because that's how we do asset compliance, right? But can you take transactional log backups for Postgres? Sort of. You can sort of back up the wall log. You can sort of move it to another place. But again, remember that in Postgres, it's all on the file system. So the wall log is actually represented as a bunch of files on the file system. In SQL Server, you have an LDF file. You have a transaction log file. That's the file. It's all right there. In Postgres, you don't have that. You have files literally sitting on your drive that say wall log, and they're a bunch of binary numbers that are there over and over. You can literally look at these and see them. Can't exactly translate them easily. I mean, it can be done, but they're just sitting there on your file directory. So it's not the same as saying backup log to do this. You have to do different things to do that. Some of the things that are very important about backups is that most people in Postgres started what's known as dump, PG dump. So PG dump is a process that simply takes all those files, all those components, and dumps it down to a text file, essentially. And I'm not kidding, it kind of dumps it down to a text file. They're very large, and they sometimes can take a long time. But you can actually open these text files if your thing's not too big and see create table, create user, create all this stuff. It'll all show up inside that text file. So dump was one of the very first early on kind of Postgres backups. It's still used by a lot of people today. Base backup is the other one that's more of a full backup. Now the base backup backs up the entire server of Postgres. Now, here's where we'll talk about deviant schema a little bit. Let me make sure that everybody understands this. A Postgres server has multiple databases, just like SQL Server, but it also has multiple schemas. And one database in Postgres cannot talk to another database. So that's a very, very big difference. In SQL Server, we join across databases, we query across them, we do all sorts of things. In Postgres, one database cannot see another database. One database's schema can see any other schema inside there, but they cannot see another database. So a lot of the times we equate in Postgres schemas to databases in SQL Server. Because if you take SQL Server and you migrate it straight across, and you have, let's say, 50 databases on your SQL Server, and you do that in Postgres, those 50 are not going to talk to each other. You can, if you connect, you can still connect via an app, but you cannot join across them. It won't work that way. So let's see here. I did get one question. When is it better to use Postgres for SQL Server? We'll get to that question, but we got to talk more about some of these other things first. I can't just give you an answer there. It's a huge, it depends. So keep that in mind while you're doing this, is that your schemas are really closer to what you're looking for in Postgres to a database in SQL Server is a schema, not a database. So when I say a DB-based backup does the entire Postgres server, I mean that it backs up the entire directory where all those files are, and it puts it onto another server or another place. That's how it does the backup. Once again, this is not a backup file. This is not a .bak because it's not the OS of SQL Server doing it. It's not packaging that all up. It's literally copying all that data from one file directory to some other file directory somewhere else on the network or on your server, however you're doing your backup. But it's a copy of files. Okay, so that's really what a base backup is. So it's very important to understand that Postgres doesn't have that engine-like thing that SQL Server has. Now, there's pluses and minuses to that. I'm not here to say that's better than one way or the other. It just means that the Postgres instance is a lot more connected to its file system versus SQL Server that's a lot more connected to the file system that's built into SQL Server. So it's more proprietary versus more we're using whatever file system we're on. Okay, so that kind of answers some of the questions on dumps, backups. You should be doing something like this. If you come into a Postgres instance, you're most likely going to find dumps running. Dumps take a long time. They run basically forever. You can do one table. You can do one database with a dump and put them down a file. So that's why they're kind of nice. A base backup can only do the entire server. It can't do anything else. Cannot do a table, it cannot do a single schema or anything like that. It has to do the entire server. So sometimes it can take a lot longer. And that means if you need to restore that Postgres database, if someone drops a table with a base backup, you have to restore the entire server off to another place. So that could be a very long process sometimes if that's done. We had a system where we were doing dumps, And it was nice because we kind of had the dump there and we could get to the file easily, but then we started doing base backups and the only thing we could do was restore the entire server. So we always had to bring up another server essentially, and then restore that base backup on top of it just to get to our data. So it took a lot longer to do some of those things. A dump, you can take to any Postgres server and just say, run this file into that database in Postgres, and it'll just create the database and do all the work. So there's plus and minuses to all of these. There was a really good SQL Friday. That's the new thing that we're doing on blogging. Last month, November's ads talked about base backups and backups. That was the SQL Friday. So if you go to my blog, you'll find last month's entry about backups, and there's a whole bunch of good information about it. Okay. Scheduling I put on here. I want to make sure I touch on that too.
Well, real
Scheduling-
quick,
Yeah.
Chad has a question in the chat. He asks, are user logins at the database level?
Yes, more, well, yeah, sort of. So there, you create a server login, but then you also grant it permissions in your schema. So they're kind of both there, but yes, you have users at the schema and everything else, and it does recreate them when you do the dump or the base backup, it brings those users back. Does that answer the question, Chad? I think I got a thumbs up. Yeah, okay. Good question. Excellent thing that I did not mention. Scheduling in here, what I mentioned here on scheduling is that, again, because you don't have an OS like SQL Server has inside its system, there is no SQL agent. Postgres depends on cron tabs. Cron tabs in Linux are basically like a Windows task scheduler. Now, please understand, to all my Linux friends, cron tabs are way, way better than Windows task scheduler. I'm just trying to give something that's related to the environments. Windows task scheduler stinks compared to cron tabs. But cron tabs really are the way that you do all of your scheduling inside Postgres. For any jobs, anything else, you basically have to write cron, you have to write bash scripts that go to cron, or Python scripts, or some sort of script that uses the cron scheduler to run and then does something against the server. There is some scheduling tools that people are building into Postgres. There's actually one called PG cron that actually puts like a cron sort of thing inside the database. It makes tables and everything else. So there are some of that out there, but it's out of the box. There is no scheduling tool besides using cron on Linux. Or if you're doing a Windows on Postgres, you would use Windows Task Scheduler as your cron essentially. So keep that in mind that there's no scheduling built into Postgres right off the bat. You got to put it in there yourself. Okay, any other questions on backups? Jonathan, did I get yours answered related to the backup question?
I think I have one more question. So in SQL Server, say we have a busy OLTP server. We want very frequent log backups running.
Yep.
What's the equivalent of that in Postgres?
I would do a secondary server. So in Postgres, basically it's log shipping on steroids. What it does is it copies the logs over to another server and then replays them, essentially. And so you can do that same thing and not replay them. You can put them off somewhere and then replay them later. But what we typically do is we have a secondary server and we just start replaying them over to the secondary server.
So in Postgres, we rarely get our hands on the log backups ourselves. We just kind of take
Correct.
the equivalent of a log backup and send it somewhere to do something.
Correct.
And if we need that second place, then we're in trouble, but we've got something.
Right. Well, the other reason is what's really nice is that, so SQL Server has availability groups and things like that now, and mirroring that all came out, but Postgres kind of from the start had a primary and secondary. They were always kind of there. So we typically in Postgres, you'll see a primary and you'll have a secondary where people are reading from it. And that's your wall log shipping. In other words, it's a standby. It's able to actually read from while it's standby. You can't write to it, but you can read from it. And so it's frequently used as that. But if you needed to promote it, you could then promote it too as well if you needed to do that. So
and then take a dump of your secondary, what is now the primary, and restore it on your failed box.
Yeah, on some other box. Yes.
Cool.
Yeah. So that's kind of where you get to it. But again, you can't really think that there is a transaction log. It's a wall log, but you don't manage it nearly like you do with SQL Server because again, it's not an OS level thing.
We do different things with it.
Yeah, exactly. But it can fill up. It can fill up. It's got the same problem when you deal with replication. If you've got replication going and replication stops for some reason, your wall log can fill up. Same thing. So you do have to deal with it. Okay, so now we've got connected. We figured out where our backups are, or we at least know some of the things we can do for backups. And those are the key critical things. Now let's talk about what's actually different between Postgres and SQL Server. And the most important one was the schema thing that I kind of just brought up. I wanted to make sure I answered the questions and everything, but basically, I really wanted to make sure everybody understood the schema and database differences. And I have a slide here in just a second that shows you kind of a little bit of a picture. Tables are still tables. There's no difference there. Procedures and functions are backwards. It's kind of weird in Postgres. It's not weird, but they did it differently. So in SQL Server, you're used to a stored procedure having all sorts of logic in it, all sorts of things, and it takes inputs, it does some work, and then it pushes things back out, or it does some things after that. In Postgres, that's functions. And stored procedures in Postgres are more, no, you're just going to run whatever I tell you to and return, and that's it, and you don't do anything else. So the two are flipped. So when you say a function in Postgres, you're talking about a stored procedure in SQL Server. When you say stored procedure in SQL Server, you're talking about a function in Postgres. Okay, they do have stored procedures in Postgres, like I said, but they do not operate the same way that SQL Server does. So that's a huge difference whenever you start to see these. And I'll show that, I think, yeah, right here. I kind of show tables. The one on the right is SQL Server Management Studio. The one on the left is a Postgres database. Okay, these are basically the same things. But you can see here that they somewhat look the same, but where you're very different is the programmability of functions down there. You're going to find it over here more in the functions, not the stored procedures, okay? Functions, in SQL Server, we had table, scalar, aggregate. That's more of procedures in Postgres versus SQL Server. I know it's a little confusing, but nobody said this was going to be easy. It's definitely going to be a little confusing no matter what you do.
Should we be careful using stored procedures in Postgres?
Not well, you should just know that if you take a SQL Server app and you port it to Postgres, which is a common thing to do, or something else, and you're moving it over there, when you start creating stored procedures in Postgres, they're not going to do the same things that they did inside SQL Server. They're not going to, like, I do believe in Postgres, they don't have outputs from stored procedures, like nothing comes out of it. Whereas in a function, you can input it and output it. So in stored procedures, you could output some sort of variable or something else out of it. In Postgres, you can't do that with a stored procedure, so it'll fail.
So before we get too crazy, we should do our homework.
Yes, absolutely. Cool. And you should know that how do I write this here to there? And then how do I translate those names and everything else? So that's an important thing to concept to keep in mind and to understand. The other thing is that my presentation here is not really about how do you migrate from one to the other. It's much more about when you're handed this thing, where do I go look for these things? I want to make sure when you're looking in here, because this happened to me, I went down into Postgres and I immediately looked for stored procedures and there was nothing. But then in my company, I looked at functions and there was hundreds of them. In the current company, there's literally tens of thousands of them. And I'm like, why are there so many functions? You know, I'm used to SQL Server having maybe a few functions here and there, or table value functions. No, there was just tons of them. And I realized functions are stored procedures in SQL Server from a Postgres standpoint. So that's the differences between them. Okay, everything else in here, views are views, tables are tables. That's not a problem. Triggers are triggers. They do act differently. I'm not gonna tell you they don't. There's definitely little tiny instance differences, but we're not gonna deep dive too far into that. Okay, we're not gonna go too far into that because it takes way too long. There's a lot of good presentations and there's some good blog posts out there on what exactly is different between them on indexes and stuff like that. I intend to write a few of them in the future, but right now I was trying to get more of a general statements out there before I got too far in depth into it. Okay, next one, fourth day. Oh, you know what? I got to go back to one thing. So this picture is Glacier National Park. If you have never been there, I strongly suggest it. This is one of the very, very giant mountains right at the visitor center. It's a beautiful, beautiful place. Go out and see it. Okay, fourth day. What's that burning smell? So now, what happens? What do you do when you've been handed this Postgres instance and all of a sudden somebody says, I can't connect? Or somebody says, production's on fire, I can't figure out anything. What do I do? How do I look for it? Where do I go? So, because that's what happens to DBAs, right? We're handed something, we figure out if it has backups, which it probably doesn't, and then all of a sudden it's like it's broken. They don't call us when things work magically, right? They call us when things are broken. So where do you go? What do you look for? Current activity. So in SQL Server, we have who is active, one of the great procedures out there in the world. And when I come over to Postgres, I'm like, all right, where's who is active? And I'm like, we don't have that. I'm like, what do you mean? What do you mean we don't have that? We don't have that. We have PG stat activity. So you can see activity and it does show you what's going on the server, but nobody's really written something like who is active, showing you blocks and locks and memory and CPU and all these different things. It's just not there. So you do have to look at activity. And I'm going to show you a page here in just a second that can kind of give you some of this overall, again, going for the simple things before you dig in and write your own code. What locks are going on in the system? What's the connection count? So let me briefly stop on connection count. When you're in SQL Server, you're used to a couple thousand connections or something like that to your database. It's not that big of a deal. And Postgres, it's a very big deal. So Postgres manages its connections a little differently than SQL Server. When you connect to a database in Postgres, you're given a certain amount of resources. SQL Server does this as well, but Postgres never takes it back. In other words, you can literally kill a Postgres instance if you over-connect it with too many things, because every user has a block of memory and it keeps that block of memory no matter what. It doesn't let it go. So when I first started with Postgres, the rule was you don't get above 800 to 900 connections on your Postgres 9.6 server at all. You don't even get to that point. If you get to that point, you're going to start crashing your box and things are going to go wrong and stuff like that. Now with the later versions and 14 and 15 and stuff, it's much closer to a 1,500 to 2,000 number, but you're going to find a lot of Postgres instances out there have what's known as PG bouncer in front of it. PG bouncer is simply a traffic cop, essentially. It's a pool. It's a pool of database connections that makes one connection to the database, and then it keeps serving up multiple connections to everybody else on the other side. So it's the way of scaling Postgres so that you don't have to worry about those connections. But do keep in mind, when you start to inherit a Postgres instance, if you're seeing thousands of connections in that Postgres instance, you might be running into problems because it was not designed the way Postgres wants it to be designed. Postgres wants one connection. It wants it reused by the application, not reconnect over and over and over again. And I bring this up because a lot of applications are designed to reconnect over and over and over again, okay? So it is a problem for Postgres. It is not a problem on the SQL Server side. And then the last piece on this one is the wall log, which, like I said, I talked about a little bit earlier. The wall log, the important thing to know there on the wall log is that if your wall log is filling up, basically 99% of the time, and I probably shouldn't say 99, but that's what it almost always is that you have a replication out there. They have logical replication in Postgres. It's just like transactional replication for SQL Server. If that logical replication stops on the master, it will hold that wall log open, just like in SQL Server, until someone comes and grabs data from it. So the wall log will just keep going, and fill up the drive. It'll do the exact same thing, just like, again, in transactional or something else, if you stop it, and then it has to hold all those transactions in place. So that's probably the biggest thing you're ever going to run into on the wall log, is that when you have replication, it'll fill up. You don't run into too many other things with it. There's some other minor ones, but we're not going to deep dive into that. So here's just a simple, and I really hope that you guys can see the squares on this. Like I said, my monitor on here is blocking this out. But here's a simple in PG admin. This is PG admin that you're looking at right here. You can see it has a simple dashboard to tell you what's going on, what sort of database sessions are there, what transactions, stuff like that. So when you come up to that point where somebody comes up and says production is on fire, you can go to this in your graphical tool. You don't have to write a PG stat statements. You don't have to write PG stat activity. You don't need to write one of those queries. This is built into PG admin, and it's not bad. It's not, you know, this is not Datadog level. This is not Quest software, anything like that, Redgate, any of those pieces. This is just a good interface for you to see some of these things. Once you start getting further along and you're doing a lot more with Postgres, or you're managing it more, you should leave this interface and do something on your own. Roll your own, use Grafana, use Zabbix, use something like that to manage your stats, New Relic, whatever it may be. But for starting out, this is a good place to start. You can find what's going on inside there. Because obviously you'll see sessions and tuples. You'll notice here that it doesn't really talk about like CPU and memory and stuff like that. Again, this goes back to Linux. You usually do that in a program called top, which you do at the command line to see those sort of things. You don't do that as much on the database tools. You do that directly on the system. So we typically have either someone looking at the system and somebody looking at the database, or you have a database person that knows how to get there on the command line, type top, and look at the system that way. And that's where you see CPU, that's where you see memory, that's where you see all those components. So, like I said, there's a really big difference there between like the OS and how tightly coupled it is versus SQL Server has a lot of this stuff already built into it. The other point I'll add to that, using Linux and stuff like that, is that I just lost my train of thought on that one. I was going to mention top was what I was going to mention. There's a lot of great tools out there for top or Grafana that can do this work for you. If you're working in Linux and you're doing things like that, make sure you connect with your system admins. They might already have these tools there, so you can go and look at your server and look at your settings from them instead of trying to do it yourself. It might make your life a lot easier if you do those sort of things. So, okay. Any questions on this so far? Oh, I promise no gingerbread were harmed in the making of this photo. I was at a hotel in Washington. It was really cool, Spokane, Washington. And I guess they had some sort of competition for the best gingerbread man, and the chefs made this. This is not actually on fire, it's just a light, but it was really cute. And I thought, what a perfect way to show my database is on fire, right? I guess I'm just weird like that to think that, but. All right. Okay, now the most important thing, right? Most important thing, because I have not mentioned it yet at all, is where is my query plans? Where are my query plans? Where's my show plans? How do I see things? How do I fix things? And how do I tune things? Because that's the other major component of what we do as DBAs, right? How do we get to some of these things? Okay, let me just bring it down to you right now. There's not a query plan explorer. Okay, there's not a tool. There's some tools, I show it right up here. What they use is what's known as explain. Explain will tell you about your query plan. You type explain, the query, and then it'll spit out a big text long thing of all this different stuff that they're going to tell you. I believe it's my next slide. Yes. So on the top is the SQL Server version. On the bottom is what you get from an explain plan from Postgres. You'll get it as text. Now, some people in the community, this gentleman right here, Despes, has created a website that if you take this information that's right here and you copy and paste it into that website, it'll give you a nice, beautiful graphical picture of it. There's actually a new one out there too. I just saw that actually builds an entire diagram too. So that's pretty cool. So those are out there to help you get those graphical plans. Now, the good news is that the text plan, while it looks different than what you're used to inside SQL Server, it's still telling you a lot of the same things. Will warn you though, they use index scan in Postgres, and index scan is fine. It's not a bad thing, it's a good thing. Whereas in SQL Server, we're always looking for a seek, and we try to get away from some of those scanning things. Well, in Postgres, a scan is not a bad thing. You're not going to see a seek. It doesn't say those things. It says sequence scan, but not index seek. It doesn't exist. So keep that in mind that as you go through explain plans, you're going to have to translate some language here and there. But it still goes down to telling you the number of rows, how wide it is, the time, that cost is an arbitrary number assigned to one of the lines of code. So you can say if it has a very high cost, you can say in this procedure, that was my highest number. It's kind of like the percent on SQL Server. I know that the cost of this row is really high, so that's what's causing most of the pain in my procedure. Don't compare costs across procedures. They're not the same thing. The number is arbitrary. You cannot use it across two different plans. You have to look at the cost for this plan, you have to compare it, and then you have to look at the cost again, only for that plan. Do not try to query it to other plans, okay? Also, as much as Chad loves to talk about the query plan store and everything like that, sorry, but there's not a query plan store in Postgres at all. It creates a plan every time. It doesn't really reuse them too much. So unfortunately, there's no plan store for that. Plan Explorer I mentioned here, there's not a lot of tools out there like that. There's not a lot we can do for that. Indexes are relatively the same. There are some new indexes that Postgres has that SQL Server does not, like a gen index for textual sort of full text search. SQL Server has full text search, so it's very similar, but they act a little bit differently. There's also in Postgres, there's a lot of GIS data and geo data, and they have indexes around those too as well. And those are different than what you would see inside SQL Server. So not all the indexes are one-to-one, but when you talk about, a primary clustered index, a primary key, those sort of things, those still act very similar to what they do in SQL Server. There is a little bit of difference. Well, it's not really a difference. I've just found that the optimizer in Postgres is really big on left to right. So as long as your index starts with the same columns left and then going to the right, you're probably going to use the index. It's not always that you have to have everything in there, but you have to have some of it in there and it has to be left to right. So again, not too different from what SQL Server was. Most of the tuning stuff that I've done inside SQL Server has applied directly to Postgres just as well. Rarely do I find things that are too far different that like, oh, I went and did this and it completely went slower in Postgres than what I did in SQL Server. It just wasn't as optimized as what I expected there. Okay, so Postgres makes me feel sad. No, that's not right, Andrea. It doesn't make you feel sad. It's a wonderful tool. So definitely you should use this site though, explain.despes.com. It's a wonderful, wonderful site to give you plan explorers. When you do this, do explain. He also gives you what you need up there because you can do explain, you can do buffers, you can do analyze. There's all sorts of little things you can do there. And explain is like, what am I thinking of for query plans? You have actual query plans and estimated. I just lost their names in my head. Explain is an estimated. Explain analyze is an actual. Okay, they're the same thing. Explain analyze runs the query. Explain simply runs an estimate of the query, just like SQL Server for those. Okay. Let's see, what else do I have on this one? I'm trying to think if I had anything else. I don't think so. Any questions on this one, on one of these related to performance? And
Does
go ahead.
Does Postgres have weight stats?
Sort of. They have this newer feature. I want to say that it came out in 11, maybe it was 10. So current version of Postgres is 14. 15 is actually, I think, released, but it was released like 3 months ago, so be careful. A lot of people are on 10 or 11 or 12. Those are very common right now. It's called PG stat statements, and PG stat statements kind of rolls up a lot of the queries and then gives you stats about them. So there are stats out there. There's more statistics on the tables, less weight stats. Does that make sense? It's less about the weight stats and it's more you have statistics on the table. So they don't have a ton on weight stats.
How would we like troubleshoot blocking?
So they do show locks. There is a table for locks. We did have a query. I'd have to try to share it here in my screen or whatever. We do have a query for showing blockers and lead blockers and stuff like that too. So you can run a query and say, here's all the locking queries and here's who we believe is blocking or leading the block. So that's all still doable. It's not, like I said, there's not tools out there. You have to write the SQL query, but once you write it, it's yours. So it's the same thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Probably the biggest thing too on the stat statements and the stat activity, one of the things that we've really looked for, the stat statements now has this a little bit more, but it was really hard when I first got to Postgres to find this query is taking this much CPU and this much read and this much write and this much memory. It doesn't really tell you that in the activity. It just says this query is here and it's doing something. Doesn't really tell you the stats. Now with PG stat statements, you can get that, but it's not necessarily live at that time. It's more of a rolled up sort of thing that starts to tell it. So that's a big difference because you're used to, when you see activity from SQL Server, it says, here's the CPU it's using, here's the writes, here's the reads. That wasn't really in there in Postgres. They had to add it more into the stat statements later on. Okay. Any other questions on performance? Lamborghini Countach, one of the most dangerous cars in the world, but obviously in the 1980s, it was the greatest car. This was taken here in Salt Lake City. It was quite cool to see, but don't ever want to drive one of those things. They're very dangerous. All right, now on the 6th day, so now you're a little bit further along. We're kind of here. We're close to the end of the week, and keep in mind, a DBA week is always 6 days or 7 days, right? We don't have weekends. That doesn't happen. So should I really keep doing this? Should I keep looking at Postgres? Well, let me make it even worse for you. So where are my config and where are my settings? And Jonathan, this is where you asked where the wall logs were, but I thought you were talking more about the error logs. So this is where config is where you really get into, you need to kind of understand where your Linux counterparts are, because your config and everything else related to the Linux version of Postgres are all going to be done inside Linux. So the first thing I had to learn when I was doing Postgres was like, okay, how do I set something like max memory? Or how do I set this memory buffer? How do I set these settings? I had to learn to edit text file with Vim. The Vim editing tool for Linux. A lot of people are like in Windows, like, what's Vim? It's a notepad essentially on steroids in Linux that you use in command prompts. You typically use it to edit configuration files, or people write entire code bases in it if they love Vim. I personally don't love Vim. I use it, but that's about it.
Don't say Emacs. Don't say you like Emacs.
No, we won't get into that debate. Like I said, once you start doing it, you'll have to get into that debate, but I stay away from it. I'm like, it's a tool, I use it, it's a notepad. That's what it is. So where do you find the config settings? They're all inside those text files. There is a postgres.conf file that everything runs off of for the entire Postgres conf. You can query it though too as well. There are query commands that you can use to show some of the settings, and you can even configure them with SQL directly as well. So you can do, like in SQL Server, you do show config, and in Postgres, you can do the same thing. You can query a config table. You can see what those are. You can set them to different things, and some of them are active right away, and some you have to restart the server. There's different settings that tell you that. So it's not that you only have to use that file, but you definitely need to learn where that file is and where it is on the system, because your first editing of it is going to be more likely in Linux or at the command line versus in a graphical interface of some sort. Now, that's completely untrue if you're talking about Amazon or Azure or one of those. They have those config files built into the GUIs and you can see them there, but that's if you're doing the cloud server system. If you're doing it on premise, you're going to have to find the config file. Okay, and when I say find it, it's not hard to find. You can say show config, and it tells you the path to it. But again, if you're not used to Linux, you have to find that path wherever that is inside the file system. So it's the things that you need to do. The difference is there. The settings are there. They're very similar in relational settings. Like I said, there's some max memory settings, there's some buffer settings. These are unique to Postgres to make it do different things. You can't easily compare. SQL Server has this this memory setting, so Postgres has to have this one, and it's not the same thing. They handle those very differently. Keep in mind that Postgres is very connected to its operating system. So a lot of the times, we used to say in SQL Server, if you give it too much memory, it'll suck down all the memory of Windows and crash the box. Well, yeah, Postgres can do the same thing because it doesn't even try to limit. In other words, it sort of does, but it's just connected to the memory on the box. It has no grab this memory. It's literally using whatever's on the box. That's what. So differences, I talked about that a little bit. Drive differences. So again, I kind of talked about this very much at the beginning, but you think about SQL Server and you say, well, we're running out of space. Let's just add another MDF file or another LDF file onto another drive and we'll be fine. Yeah, that's a little hard in Linux and Postgres. Trying to move like your database onto another drive or extend it onto another drive, it doesn't work well at all. There's definitely some things out there that are getting a little better with partitioning and with, if you architect it first where this database is broken apart and you have different file groups for it, then you can. But if it's just like, we're in a bad spot, we just need to put another drive on the system and stretch it out over to there, that's not going to work. It's just not going to happen because it's so tied to those file systems. You can't just extend it. SQL Server has that all built in because it makes those files and it writes those files, whereas Postgres is directly connected to its Linux system. So that's the big issue, the big change between those things. What's Linux again? You're going to be asking yourself that a lot. I mentioned Linux a lot in this presentation on purpose because, again, a lot of the times one of the most harder things that you're going to learn about getting into Postgres is not learning Postgres. You can learn that because it's very similar in relational database to SQL Server, but learning all the Linux aspects of it and the things that work and manage with it, that's where you have to take your time and spend. and really figure those things out. Again, if you're not comfortable in a command line interface and working with something like Linux, you're going to have a lot harder time. Nothing's stopping you from doing it. I did it just fine. I came up to speed. There was no problem, but you're definitely going to have to do it. And that's what you're going to have to learn. Okay, before I get to my last slide here on the 7th day, just before we rest, I wanted to answer this one question that Thomas posted in here. And he said, when is it better to use Postgres versus SQL Server? And I have to give you the standard DBA answer of it depends. You cannot answer that in any other way. So what are our pros and cons? SQL Server is a licensed model that you have to buy those licenses from Microsoft. So you're going to have a higher cost. Everybody says, well, Postgres is free, so it's better. No, it's not true. Because what do you spend your time and money on in Postgres? You spend your time and money on people that know how to run it, manage it, and Linux and system administrators to deal with that. So are you gaining anything by not paying the licensing cost versus paying for all of those things in Postgres? That's a discussion for you and your company, not for anyone else. You can't make that for every single person. I have always maintained and said the Microsoft and the proprietary licensed software, Oracle, Microsoft, all of these things, they give you a faster start. They give you more tools, more ease of use, and more training right up front easily to get started. But when you go into the open source world, you're investing more in people and training them and teaching them, and you're investing in their career and moving forward and things like that. So which is better? Again, you can't answer that. If we talk just purely performance, like which is faster? Again, I'm not going to give you an answer there because I have watched SQL Server fall flat on its face when somebody wrote a bad application against it. And I've now been in 4 Postgres environments and they all fell flat on their face when somebody wrote a bad application on it. So it's all about what you're using for what's good for your job. I will say Postgres, if you're getting started and you're starting out, I would strongly suggest looking at a Postgres instance because without the licensing costs, I always prefer to invest in people more than I do a licensed software product. Now, I will tell you though, I guarantee you that a team can probably get up to speed a lot faster on SQL Server if they're new, if they know it on SQL Server than versus something on Postgres. If you've got a team that doesn't know Linux or anything like that, and you're just handing it to them, it's going to take them a lot longer to get up to speed than if you're handing them SQL Server because it's got so much more built into it. So which is better? That's for you to decide, not for me. So, and I'm happy to come and chat with any companies and consult and let you know that same thing. Okay, so on the 7th day, we rested, right? No, you don't rest. You're a DBA. You never rest. On the 7th day, you went and saw the community. You went out to the community because that is very, very important. The community is very important both to Postgres and to SQL Server. And we want more and more people in our Postgres community. So I tell everybody the Postgres community to me is a lot like the SQL Server community back in 2006 or 2007, maybe even 2005. People say to me, well, hold on, Pat. The Postgres community has been around for 20 plus years. We've had events, we've had all these things. Yes, but you're also still very, very developer centric. And that's what we were in SQL Server back in 2006. If you go to a past summit or something now, SQL Server is very heavily DBA centric because there's a lot more DBAs in the world. In Postgres, we're still getting DBAs. When you literally look for Postgres DBA out there, it's probably the hottest new job out there. Most of these Postgres instances have still been managed by developers and engineers. They haven't really had dedicated DBAs. Some of the large ones, absolutely. Some of my good friends in the community have been DBAs for 10 plus years on Postgres, but it's not the common thing that everyone is doing. So having the same numbers are not there. So I strongly suggest if you get put into a place where you're dealing with Postgres, you join some of these communities. The best one to start out with is Slack. I don't know why my link is not working here. Maybe it's because they're all on that Wright DB consulting page. But there is a Postgres Slack out there. There's a Postgres Discord, and then there's a Postgres Docs. Now, I will tell you right now, the Postgres community loves its Postgres Docs. And they are very detailed and they are very good at telling you what you need to do. They're just really bad, in my opinion, at giving examples. It seems like they're kind of light on those examples of here's how you would use this, or here's an example of what the code looks like, that sort of thing. They leave that really up to the end user to do. And keep in mind, Postgres is an open source project, so anyone can go and modify those docs, and they'll immediately tell you that. If I complain about the docs, they'll say, well, go edit it. and commit and be in committer and change the docs. Yes, that is something that you can do. But again, when you come from a SQL Server world where all those docs and everything is already given to you, it's kind of hard to get into that phase of let's just go and edit these and make these better and do that time. So there's a balance there with the docs. I do suggest going to them. I do suggest looking them up. But by all means, you should join the community and start to see blog posts or videos or trainings that might help you a lot more get up to speed on Postgres than just reading the docs, that being the only thing. So that's my suggestion on the community side of things. We do have a Postgres users group. It says right there, Utah Postgres users group. We have been trying to meet. We have not been very active. I'm hoping to change that next year. I do lead the group. If you're interested in any presenting on it or talking about it, please just hit me up. You can find me on that page. You can find me here. I'm not hard to find by any means. So that's the important part about the community is join your community, whether you're in SQL Server or in Postgres. Okay. That is all I have for today. That is the end of my session. You are welcome to leave if you want. I am more than happy to answer a few more questions, but I really, really appreciate the time. And I hope that this has shown that once again, Postgres is not something to fear or be afraid of or not get into. It's something that's really active, a really great database. And if you are in SQL Server, you can learn Postgres. Keep in mind, this is not brain surgery or anything else. You can do this and it's not going to be that difficult for you. So please reach out if you have any questions. And like I said, I'll stay for Q&A for a few minutes. Thank you very much for your time.